Hello everyone, today we talk about how to choose a PhD topic, and I'll try to keep it as straightforward as possible. I confess you that I tried to make this video already twice and I couldn't actually be satisfied with it because in a way, first of all, I have this tendency to digress, but in a way there is always this other great difficulty of trying to explain something so important for as an advice, I would say, if anything, because I rarely hear any of the stuff around, and I wish I had had an advice myself before starting these things, without of course making reference to my personal path, because every research is of course different. There is always it starts from you, and of course even the topic of research we'll be discussing today is something very personal, right? It really pertains to you in an intimate way. It's your research, it's your idea, it's what you really want to research for years. So it's really important, right? It cannot be diminished by saying, do this and that. So of course, I can't give you any topic for research if not, knowing maybe certain historiographical fields that are yet to be properly explored. But what I want to stress here is the importance of the validity of your own ideas, right? As you know, I have this, tendency to, support authority and order and discipline and all these things. So in a way, I have an appreciation for hierarchical, for hierarchy as such, and therefore the advice of those who have gone beyond, right, and already that have there are ahead in time, even just biologically, professors that have studied for decades a certain topic and so on. And when we pick the topic of what this research question should be, it's obvious that many people, and generally and understandably and choose on the base of advice in a way, and or are followed throughout their path of research by figures that, however, tend to influence their own research. I was extremely lucky, in my view, not just in the way I got in the PhD that I will talk about in the video dedicated to the selection, that, however, is connected to this one, because of course you have to present your research topic during that phase, at least one of those stages, but also because of the freedom, the essential freedom I was left by my tutor, my department, the broader university system. That is something that I know many people do not quite have in the same way. And in order to explain this, of course, I have to bring in my own experience. And so for me, like, the advice that I'm going to give you, and that's why I make this premise, is going to be molded on the base of that experience. And I can tell you, I went close to not making it. There is always a moment during the research in which you have really to take the reins of the thing, even against the odds, because of course a research, you're supposed to provide with something new that by definition thus is unknown, right? You don't know it, other people in theory don't know it, meaning you should also be very careful at choosing topics that have not been satisfactorily treated. I witnessed during the selection the elimination of many candidates simply because they hadn't made the effort to properly check or at least to conceive concretely the fact that some of their topics have been if not completely exhausted, but still been covered in a way that, think about that didn't was not worth the amount of money and time that the research entails, right? You have to stay with this question for years, right? My research lasted 3 years and a half. It should have been just 3 years, but because of COVID, I also was lucky, frankly, with the fact it was lengthened. So these experiences can be very wild in nature. You know that many people bail out for the most diverse reasons. Some get depression because it is pressuring. I think I was lucky even in that regard, for that matter, because even if it was exhausting at a point, I always maintained control of the thing, and finally I decided I managed to do what I wanted. But still I was lucky, right? Even in a negative way, meaning that maybe I didn't deserve exactly the same result I got. But in a way, life is always like this, that there is everything is unpredictable. It's a mistake, even scientifically speaking, for a researcher to presume that everything can always go well at the same time. There should be that minimum of anxiety, of pressure that that spurs you healthily to make a good work, right? And at the same time, however, a lot of confidence in what you're doing, right? And therefore, even if I of course believe that there is a scientificity, a rational, and hell has it there is, in, let's say, mechanism that also entails things like friction, like properly the material difficulties in even getting the sources of things like these. I believe that the most important element in this all is picking a question, because the research project is a question fundamentally. It's not just you talking about a project. It's like there's a mean to an end, right? You have to explain why you wanna do this, make this research, and you have to properly pose a question that is something question mark, that is, and let's find out that, which is what the research should be about, is always to be very independent-minded, right? If you have an intuition, you should follow it. Because fundamentally, history without intuition, like science without intuition, is nothing, right? You can't think that there is a prearranged set of knowledge of topics, of fields, etc., that will essentially explain themselves just by sticking to them, right? You are the one who has to make the thing done, and this is possibly the most important aspect of the whole research. That thesis will not write it by itself, right? And so I already made the first chapter, the doctoral series, dedicated to motivation. Perhaps I was not so effective, as I described in this few minutes now. I wish I had said this thing in the same way, but in a way, there are many. Of course, this video is connected to that one as much as the one of the selection and the broader any element, any one of the series eventually. But it's really crucial to stick to that, maybe not to make, when you have properly to enter, because you see, the first time you pose yourself seriously the question itself, right, is when you have to present your research project in the context of the selection, right? So you have to have thought about it from some time already. Right. First of all, there is a deadline for which you have to submit the project. So eventually you'll have to discuss it later on during the selection. But already you should come from with something in mind from before. So in my case, it was brutal, right? Because my objective at that point wasn't quite the research in itself. And this is interesting because, of course, as I was saying before, this is normal in my opinion, because again, you cannot know exactly how it works until you do it. The research, again, you don't know where it will lead you. You don't know how it will be. You don't know whether you will fail or succeed yet. You don't know how to do it. You don't even know what sources to look at, initially speaking. What should be enough is a clear historiographical assessment, that is to say, you have to be sure of what has already been written about the topic for you to formulate the question and defending it in its own necessity, right? Why would you have to pay me a scholarship for years for doing this? And also at that point in the selection, you shall explain why. So you have to become a good lawyer, defending your attorney, defending your own case. Let's say there is a different there is of course a sense of yourself, right? Because that within that project lays essentially your own person in persona properly. In the moment you have to go out there presenting the thing and defending it. So of course the bet stands there in the form of will I get in or not, right? The problem of my selection, well, I know in some places now people just pay for starting a PhD, and every university kind of makes them doing that. So there are certain countries in Europe, especially when this happens, and renowningly, the doctoral level is appalling, and everybody knows that, right? And that, to me, that on average the whole world scientific quality is sinking. Academically speaking, there is no seriousness anymore. The Barry Center falls pretty much out of that sap of curiosity and thirst of knowledge and effort and dedication and moral force and ethical strength, let's say, that should lay behind these things. I must say, I come from a tradition that, at least in Europe, we are regarded as some of the finest, right, in the continental tradition, which is indeed, let's be honest, I don't want to be partisan, the best in that sense. And in my country, surprisingly enough, because it's not a particularly overperforming country in many ways, but it's still, academically, we have something that historically would develop in a very different way on its own, a great load of theory, a great load of practice since school and all, and this goes on. In fact, we basically win all the major contexts, also abroad in neighboring countries, with some of the most important ones, international, including my own at that point in this academic fields. And so there is a broader pride and satisfaction. I don't know, I can't tell what awards, let's say, my specific department, my specific faculty won this time, but there is like, to us it's normal, right? But I've met people coming from abroad, even prestigious universities everybody has heard of normally, and because of the quality. And the same students tell us, but you study like triple the way we do. Yes, and so why does nobody talk about that? And the question is, of course, because we don't understand anymore, valorially, civilizationally, morally, scientifically, the worth of anything, right? And this, I will not start on the. Again, this is not much of a compliment to my background, because at that point you can completely fail even if you come from that, so there is nothing flattering per se. But you realize that where things work, because they are and there is a mechanism behind it that presents you with interesting ideas, after all, of why that is the case and so on. Well, one would have to take that in adequate consideration. And in my case, I was even luckier than that. Not just luckier because I live here, a few kilometers from the same university, and in our capital, in a context where I've always been kind of privileged, even though I don't think I'm a particularly intelligent person, nor I represent, I don't know, maybe the top of historians, all these things. I'm not, believe me. It's just, however, I came from a background that allowed me to access that, and to properly, a background that allowed me to understand the value of science in education, and also backing it with through itself, in a way, through this same moral dimension that I always stress, because I believe it's crucial for the development of a civilization that I see crumbling all apart. So it's very difficult to explain even somebody like what it is, because you see, I don't talk about myself. That you basically don't even know where I come from, what I do, who I am. The whole context that is, however, all what makes most of what we're talking about. I just put on the fact that I made this path, I'm kind of bragging about it, but I'm not really, that in my view that these are just formal titles, and that there are much more important things that we don't take in consideration. So for me, it was like I enjoyed it. Like, there were certain things that I didn't like, there were certain moments, across the whole path, aside from, even before the doctoral years, that I, of course, didn't like, right? But there is also something you have to pay in exchange for such journey that can really give you that much, right? I understand that, of course, and you can see it through the course of Schwerpunkt, that I dramatically developed my own view through the same doctoral research, and that there is much to it, given properly to what the structure of the research was about, which I couldn't know before starting that again, and I would discover relatively late throughout the work. But it started importantly with this there's recognition of the worth and the value of intuition. Part of the reason I couldn't make the video before is because I started complaining about the fact that, you see, as a military historian, first of all, and this is part of the thing, I was lacking a way, but at the same time I had to, in a sense, to even pay for being one of the few ones, for example, in my country, especially some, military historians, self-styled military historians are many, right? Military historians who actually study the art of war and have a real strategic culture and a specific education and everything are very rare, right? I don't think I fit even completely in this, because it's not that I have ever had a curriculum of military studies, right? There are certain things like these, that I tried even the military career, all these things, but the let's say I created my own path, right? And this was true, especially in every thesis that I had the opportunity of writing, right? And not just the obvious one, the bachelor, the master, and also the doctoral one, but probably every work that I could do autonomously within the curriculum, I dedicated to warfare, right? And Schwerpunkt is the testament, of course, of my interest during these years in other topics that had essentially nothing to do with my research, if not, fitting this broader art of war, diachronic and comparative dynamic, that without which I think I could have not even written a decent work, because my doctoral research was extremely important and it affected Schwerpunkt a lot. But honestly, I believe that Schwerpunkt affected much more in positive terms, in both ways. But Schwerpunkt was more important than the research, because it helped me dramatically from a psychological point of view, but properly taught me a lot of things. It is what I've learned thanks to Schwerpunkt is essentially what I didn't have a reason to do, even with all the books I have, to say, okay, today I will learn that. What for, right? If I don't tell it to somebody else, if I don't talk about it, try to explain, it's just reading, and reading is not learning, and learning is not studying. And so, this was very important to me. So what I'm saying here is that you should always conceive even a doctoral research as something complementary to a more comprehensive system of life, right, and moral and scientific horizons, say, because otherwise it kind of doesn't make sense. You cannot spend it. That's why there are so many people who take this degree, like me, that eventually do not know what to do with that. Well, we should be a bit more, if we don't start believing in ourselves since the beginning, if we don't devote ourselves to this since the beginning, we can't really eventually even complain of the fact that we did something just for taking a title per se, right? In my case, as I was saying before, yes, the objective was getting into the PhD, right? At that point, right, when I presented the question, my sole purpose was getting in, right? And then I thought I will sort out things later on, and I will explain you this better during the selection. But it was kind of obvious, because I was finishing my master thesis at that point. It was a summer. I was strained because I had problems with noises, misophonia. People were annoying me from the other apartment, so on. I couldn't sleep. I was like a bundle of nerves. And I spent the whole summer. I didn't go on vacation at all, because I wanted, basically, I've read, I don't know, tens of thousands of pages of medieval history manuals at that point in a single summer. While I was finishing the master thesis, I had my discussion in September, and basically selection started actually even before. And so the two things overlapped, and I still had to finish the thesis, and plus I had to come up after years and continue studying, because again, the master thesis also was kind of demanding. There were lots of exams, a lot of different things to do. I hadn't had the adequate time to prepare to everything. Like, I had to find a topic that would be essentially, again, what I would have had to go on for years with, and that's an important life choice that's going to influence, of course, the whole thing. And you have to already start. I mean, it's good, of course, to follow your intuition and so on, but of course you have to think too about what this is going to be about practically. You can't just shoot like a random topic title, and then maybe even during the selection you don't even know what it is, right? And you can't defend it, and you can't convince the people to give you the scholarship. So the question there to me was, of course, resorting to something that I wanted to learn, that I wanted to know by myself. Again, your curiosity should be the driver. It should always be about what you wonder about a certain topic that should be, in my opinion, of a certain ambition, right? That can be your ego, can be your, your habit. I personally I'm very high in conscientiousness, so and even more than openness, actually, and therefore I'm capable of an astonishing amount of spending an astonishing amount of energy, sometimes even let's say uneconomically, let's say anti-economically, but still being put on a track. I can make an astonishing amount of work, and this is in fact what it turned out. As I was saying before, I don't think I'm a dramatically qualitative historian. It's just that I've done so much that, of course, at that point, the more you push through the resistance of what history presents you with as an inquirer, the more you skill yourself in a way or another. So. And the project was quite ambitious, right? Even though at the time I didn't quite, I was already putting some, say, I don't know how to say it in English, but let's say some boundaries, some breaks, some circumscribing a bit the thing, not to make the entire thing. It was simply a question that I came up with quite randomly. Just this was the topic I had in mind for quite a time. It could have been 2-3 years. When I read from the site of a military history professor that I esteemed enormously, and that I had in fact also met just before the selection. We had gone to this with other people who were interested in these things, going to see in a museum, and had opportunity to meet this person and to come back, because also we were neighbors, by the way, to come back home on the same, in the subway together. And I asked him a couple of things regarding this, because I was quite interested in the topic that he had himself written, and therefore, and that was also a great life lesson, because it made me understand that even though that this person was probably the single, and here I'm not exaggerating, and I'm not saying that it derives from there, but it sure helped me at that point. I think this person was the greatest modern military historian, right, who unfortunately passed away exactly in the moment in which I was about to dedicate him my finished work, right? And he was a kind of a reserved person, never actually known the guy who was. I was very interested in his library, for that matter, and I should contact even his family at some point, because I would like to see what that treasure. But I realized that even though he had written that thing, of course today I know much better than anybody possibly in the world, because that's the objective of a PhD, like topping the knowledge in a certain field that hopefully has never been uncovered. That, of course, that knowledge was actually very punctual, right? The guy had made his own work, even though he was not nor an historian nor a medievalist, still was this dramatic military expert. That had fascinated me, and that I immediately understood he had not yet kind of gotten all the essentials of, relatively to a topic that actually was not exactly about the what he had written on the site, but exactly what was missing in that part. To make the long story short, the topic of the research was essentially it concerned indirectly the rise of infantries in 14th century, in early 14th century, essentially Western Europe. So we're talking about the great solely infantry victories of the Flemish, the Scots, the Swiss, the Ditmarscher, and so on. And essentially questioning, right, which is a big phenomenon, right? I already made multiple videos on this, even a question and answer, because I addressed the topic here and there, made videos about the Flemish army, also about the Battle of Courtrai, that is the most representatives. But this was actually a series of victories in the hands that happened all in the first half of the century. Then eventually Black Death arrived, and all the popular and peasant classes that had expressed those infantries essentially got a dramatic blow, and so Europe was refeudalized, and kind of infantry kept growing, but still cavalry strength was quite important, and it wouldn't be kind of an overthrowing like it was witnessed in the in the early 14th century, temporally wise, if not under eventually the guidance of the same princes during the Renaissance, right? So, but with a dramatically different social and political background with those infantrymen, and but that's yet another thing. And again, there is no need to digress on this, but I always like to add, what was the punchline, also my introduction, because I had to explain why I was so concerned instead, and this was the actual topic of the research, why in a certain European region these same infantry victories had not happened. That is, the question was literally studying the whole military history of that region for something like half of a century roughly, and in order to sort out what had happened in there, in spite being a very advanced military context, and with a hell of an infantry tradition, why that context hadn't produced a solely infantry victory, meaning literally an only infantry army, like the Flemish ones, like the Swiss ones, the Scots ones, etc. As in fact in those contexts. And it was very interesting for a number of reasons that I cannot go too much in detail without revealing the broader thing, because I still am working, as you know, I finished my work, I got my title, but I'm still working on some aspects of it for publishing it. So okay, maybe one day you will read my 700 pages purely tactical analysis on that specific topic. It's something that I'm proud of, because it's never been written. Like, a great part of my pride, it doesn't derive from much of a positive reason, but for my constant polemic and lamentation against the fact that European historiography has still not even studied these things, right? And so when I talk about kind of the essentials of military history and the art of war, like, when you realize what was actually studied to this point, it's kind of a strange, heterogeneous paste, a confused, linear, intertwining of different of works, of backgrounds, that do not have really a unitary, do not really provide a scientific, rational, unitary explanation for a certain phenomenon, simply because they have never studied the whole thing for the way it was. So I also hope to continue my academic production, let's call it in this terrifying way, on this specific topic, and also expanding to the whole European scale, properly in detail, aside from the fact that I of course addressed also this background and certain specific connections with the region I was talking about, and the ones that of these infantry victories that were actually quite strong in nature, in this political connections, in exchanges, military wise, and so on. So that's why it's also so important. And my interest was objectively a very good one. I remember that I had this idea buzzing in my head already when I started my master thesis, because there was a sort of little inquisition before starting the master thesis that said, what do you want to do? Like, why are you making this master degree? It was, incidentally, one of the commissioners was eventually my tutor that had followed me, in the bachelor, in the master, and eventually even in the PhD. And another professor, she was a modern history professor. I made an exam on her with her. Let's not say strange things. She was a very pleasant lady, and she did a beautiful exam about the English Civil War. That even there opened my eyes on lots of things. I also made different videos about the English Civil War here, but not much about that, because it was not really about military history strictly meant. The art of war, battles, and so on. But still, it provided me with a decent background and was quite fascinating. In any case, I was asked, like, what do you want to do this, right? And I remember explaining that I already wanted to do that, right? The alternative was still what you can see in that video about the Manipular Legion and the Macedonian Phalanx. I still thought at that point that I could talk, even make a decent. I was about to make my master thesis on that rather than the Battle of Markfeld, that I eventually did. It was also one of the greatest experiences in my life. In any case, also because I visited the battlefield later, etc. In any case, I had realized already by the master that was too big of a topic, right? That I would have not known how to organize it proficiently. Also because I thought I knew less, and when you know less, you of course think there is less to know proportionally. So I thought I could simply indicate a couple of battles by quoting, some books I had on the topic, and trying to have a first approach to, I don't know, maybe I would have even been able to do it, but fundamentally it would have required to study every single battle, so that would have been too complicated. So that's something just in a PhD I could do, right? And just for a single region, by the way. Yes, for something like 50, 60 years of history, but still the entire region, one of the single most, dramatically documented in medieval Europe. So with an enormity of sources to check that, again, I could surely do for a master thesis. Instead, I chose right? I thought, a single battle and campaign like Markfeld would be reductive. Instead, it took me a long time and to finish. And so I had remained in mind with this idea of why that region didn't produce infantry, during the early 14th century that could make it against cavalry. Why? And most of that was about, of course, speculation. Was about, at least, I had a theory that in partly was confirmed, and in a sense had already been put on the fore by historiography. But the only difference is that nobody had ever done an actual military inquiry on the battles and on the tactical proportions between the various arms on the battlefield, of all the military history of that region, to actually provide with the actual concrete picture of that is not picking just the most important battles and making kind of a superficial analysis and just making an hypothesis of why things in that region had gone differently. Of course, this question entailed also an important political and social attention to the context that I was putting aside. I study only war, right? So I study only properly the military dimension of war that's strictly meant, right? I don't study war because of the impact. I mean, I don't functionalize like in the new military history and all the wrong ideology that still thinks that studying a battle means to make histoire bataille. It's absolutely wrong, right? That if anything tells the radical level of ignorance that exists on warfare in our academies. But secondly, I didn't see war just in functional, political, and social explanation. Of course, you eventually have to connect the dots, but if the military dimension has a dignity on its own, just as the political and the social one, right? And so, if you want to understand the Trinity, you can't do without any of these elements, element of the thirds. So. Instead, that's what we normally do, right? A very superficial military analysis, even in those studies that are allegedly military in nature, and then, all about, because it's more important for politics and society. This war was not important to be known by itself and how it was actually made, right? What's the point of studying any military dimension if you don't know the ABC of how armies were commanded and fought on the field and operated in campaign? It doesn't make any sense. Right, it's literally stating that you don't know what violence is and how it is used and what the enormous civilizational value of the means of employment of the same, that we are also, as my thesis demonstrated, dramatically documented on in spite of all, right? I mean, what could be carved out of the information is astonishing. So my thesis was not a story, was not a broader reflect, was literally a scrupulous analysis of every single documented engagement that occurred there. We're talking about hundreds, right? Actually thousands, but hundreds, maybe just the ones that were worth being discussed because of the data you could gather from it. And so that tells you also why this was something completely new. So I ignored I knew already at the time, because I had been theoretically well framed already, in a kind of a military historical sense, properly within, and also the master thesis had helped dramatically. Studying a campaign and its battles, in it all together with all the possible sources properly acquainted me, like the final testing ground, how to do the thing, right? Which is extremely important, because it gives you that idea of the necessity of completeness of such reconstructions. Otherwise, you cannot adequately measure things like the importance of on an arm over the other, right? In terms properly, my thing was based on the relation between cavalry and infantry, right? So arms, of course, here were the only ones that existed at the time, factually, but artillery was rising, but very mildly, as also my research proved, in that concept not to make too much of a difference. There is the missile element still that, it's still contained within the arm of infantry, but still figures as an important element to consider in the balance by itself. In any case, I had that in mind, right? I had already these mechanisms in mind. It's just I didn't know that it was the greatest problem. On which sources, and how, where to find. I mean, I had an idea of where to find them, how, but I didn't know. What scared me the most is, for example, how many were there out there that I hadn't known, right? I thought I'll quote I will search in the bibliography of the books, the works that have already treated this topic, even if not so much in detail. I will pick eventually, of course, the specialistic studies that exist on these battles, look at what sources they mean. So I will pick the sources and think that those maybe are all of them. That was the greatest problem, and I discovered that also some of my colleagues had great problems in the same way of gathering. That's astonishing. When we'll get to the method, how I did the whole thing, you will be mind blown by how primitive and mechanic and kind of let's say difficult it is still to make a research like this. Not because everything is published. The problem is how to gather the information, and especially to be aware that information exists and where to search. Very often there are not kind of standard pre-packed references to those things, so you waste a lot of time. Sometimes maybe making the same research failing because you don't know where to search, right? That's dramatic, and I was terribly lucky even in that, and I'll tell you why during the thing. I had three massive lucky shots throughout all the research. I feel incredibly blessed by that, because those made the research, and that gave me the measure properly of how precious they were, but also the research was in that sense, because it was kind of a miracle I made it. And again, you would be surprised, and those are the greatest problems of our research, not the wishful thinking, not the just the motivation per se, which is crucial. It's probably the most important, but still there are some factors that can bring you down at the point that make you give up or to reduce the thing. In the first year, I didn't know what I was doing. Let's be honest about that. And then I was saved by my own, by somebody else's work, because eventually it's always like that, right? Everything you need to work, you learn from somebody else. A work that had basically used all the sources of the period in a great chronicle. It was actually a great study of the whole thing with thousands of pages, and therefore of every single event I could simply check that, and I would have all the sources available. So it was too cool. I was angry at myself for not having discovered that 1 year before, because I discovered this at the beginning of the second year, and from there on it was all smooth sailing, relatively, because also, of the pandemic and all these things. But let's say, if it hadn't been for that, which was not to be given for granted, because that work was the only work that I know existing in any kind of that format. In fact, it was also even snubbed by the rest of historiography. Most of my professors didn't even know it existed, because they are used to write just in hyperspecialistic terms that do not even take consideration such gigantic efforts. Instead, this guy I used as a support for the bibliography had done this thing only for the 14th century. It is to say, if I had made the research on the 15th or on the 13th, I would not find anything like that. So I was even lucky there was somebody who did this, and this is another somebody who, is also an old person at this point, spent his own life entirely making this work, and if it hadn't been for that person, other persons that had inspired or supported that person, I would have not made my research. So it's something that frightening, in a sense, by the if you look at the dependency of your work on such factors. But so it is, because again, you can't really, it's very difficult to create with our current education like such a wide knowledge from scratch without having an adequate systematic open access to all the references. That's a huge problem, and instead it would help creating fantastic research just if we had the possibility. In any case, I knew nothing of this all before. So in insight, what happened actually is that the topic I chose was evidently big, right? I said, but I cannot study like this entire region for 60 years saying, I will cover every single kind of source. I thought that there would, I didn't know any, I knew a few chronicles that were the major sources for those contexts, and without chronicles you cannot reconstruct anything military in the first place. Archive sources won't save you from that at all, nor they are factually even consistently relevant for making the thing done. And I didn't know those chronicles. I just knew some of them because I had already read them. I had even already trying to reconstruct by myself completely without any reason for university or anything, some campaigns. I'm the kind of person who gets thrilled by taking properly, making measurements of maps, calculating the speeds of march, the distances, all these things, because I love to see what warfare was for real, not just the the battle ideally meant, but was concretely meant. And that's why people who complain against such things really do not already declared not to know what concretely the art of war is, and that's the only possible way I could write the thesis. And what I was impressed by is that I chose that topic right. That is, not only it was a great historical question that I had even there randomly learned just because I read an article one day, and it had impressed me for that matter too, which is not so easy. It was a serious article, not the clickbaiting stuff you find all around the internet normally, and I decided to embark myself in that enterprise because it seemed to me to be large enough, and I said even too large, right? I decided that in order to stick to to something feasible, and given that especially I didn't know the sources, I would have had to concentrate not on the whole region, but at least on just certain polities within that region and comparing those polities, right? Which is something that I still did because I managed to actually cover every polity of the region. Thanks again to work of that guy that I mentioned before, and even doing much more than I had preventivated at that point before the research, because there was a point in the research that I started like that, very cautiously saying, okay, I will slowly have to find all the references, it will be boring, but I will make it. Then I spent 1 year realizing that the system didn't work because I hadn't found anything systematic. I hadn't checked enough sources, enough historiography. There was nobody recreating the actual history of that entire region. That's why I also was lucky to find that guy's work, because that guy's work did the same thing day by day. Which, again, it's not normal to find a work like that, right? A gigantic, cyclopic, thousands of pages done out of pure passion doing that. So I followed the entire history, and I could find every single engagement because that guy had done the same. And nobody even knew that this guy existed because it was seen as, just an amateur's work, a passion. This person actually used all the references that I checked, even, our scientific publications. He had read them all. He had made a great work, and nobody cared. That also tells you what historiography is sometimes, the academia is sometimes about. If you're not a professor, this was just an engineer, if I'm not wrong. There's not a professor, nobody cares, right? People are obsessed with scholarship, are obsessed with the idea that professors are superheroes that know everything, that they don't know anything. There are hardly, I must say that teachers, professors in general, are some of the most radically ignorant and uneducated people that I've ever met, right? In terms, like, other people are not, but considering the role of these people as educators, they're grossly ignorant. There are people on average that do not really know that much as you would expect, and if they did, they would even praise such types of works and would be aware of them. Instead, no, they're even like donkeys, even more narrowly, tunnel visioned, concentrated on at the end of the day, useless, hyper-specialized content. I will tell you what kind of researchers, of PhD researchers I've encountered with also with my colleagues that eventually do that exactly for avoiding the aforementioned problem. It's difficult to find all the data altogether, so okay, I will stick to something extremely narrow that nobody will ever read because it's basically ininfluent to our view of the era of that society at the same time. But you can say that you made the ultra hyper specialized perfect only 200 pages work written with all the lines distance for you to say that you have a PhD. I never seen the thing like that. To me, I wanted to answer that damned question, right? I can't be that stubborn, and I love being that, even at the point of embarking myself on something that I objectively didn't know what to do, how to do it, and that would have failed if I hadn't been so disgustingly lucky. But still, I guess that, like the Latin says, that fortune favors the bold. And I must say that that leaves you sometimes, it can go wrong as well. So I speak from the standpoint of somebody who made it, but I'm aware of the problem, and I'm aware of the difficulties and all what can happen, can go wrong in the meanwhile. Now, so at the time, I had just in the project said, okay, I will study this broader problem starting from these polities, and still not even knowing exactly, and I knew more or less which sources I would have had to privilege as types of sources, but I didn't know the sources themselves. So that's how I got in, right? I got in actually because during the selection I was good and lucky at the same time, doing the general medieval history competence part well. And as I was saying before, it had been kind of a torture. Even there I was very lucky because I literally saw the guy in front of me extracting the essay trace that we would have had to write about, and literally the other traces were written later on, were read later on, and I found out that if I had either of the other two traces had been extracted, I would have surely not passed the test, because instead, out of 16 people, I did. So that's also how lucky you can be. At the same days of the selections, I was about to crash with a motorcycle because, as dumb as I can be, I began to quarrel with a guy and just started chasing me with a car, and etc. etc. Because also I'm a kind of aggressive and violent, as sometimes I can be, it was crazy. I didn't know. I didn't even believe when I got in, because there were frankly many, because I never passed even at university as the genius, the competent. Compared to my colleagues, I can confidently say that to me, I feel like less than them. I feel they're much more cultured, educated, precise, even in language, etc. It's just I studied something else, right, in different ways. And so that also may give you the illusion that you kind of don't fit in the group. Right, sometimes even with people, I have broad interests, telling you the truth, but the only thing I know decently, really, only is military history and some other historical stuff, and not even all of it, frankly. And of course, that would be impossible. But even I can be embarrassingly ignorant in say military history at some levels if I had not, because also I want to do things well, right? If I do something, I want to do it well, and to me. Properly assessing a strategic and tactical dimension is not just hearsay, right? How many times you go around YouTube, every video about World War II, there are the people in the comments saying the worst kind of bullshit that has no historical, strategical, or any kind of logic for that matter, and you realize you're wasting your time. I can't do like that, right? I surely have my own bias, and I surely make my own mistakes, but I want to get things right? And I think that's crucial to do anything well. And so in my objective at that point, having chosen the topic, I said, I don't remember when I said, okay, I will use it. I mean, yes, I loosely remember talking about that with my tutor that eventually would have followed me. That was kind of good, and she actually didn't give too much importance to to the project, because she said the important for you is to get in through the essay, because if the written part in the selection is the most important, I will explain you why. Then in that type of selection, in my university, in that the way it works there, so for other it can be different. In my university, there is you see the system I was talking about before, there is an actual selection. It's not just getting in. In certain countries, again, you just pay and you get in. Selection is a serious thing, right? You compete among so many other people, right? Showing you must have a quality. That's something that surely exists also in other countries, but the criteria and kind of the numbers, the share. I met there the day of the selection a guy that I knew from essentially the same university, but we had worked at some project together for, it was about mods, military. This guy was, essentially an antiquist, and he was there for the third consecutive year trying to get in. And he didn't get in, nor that time. Instead, I made it the first shot. There were lots of my colleagues and someone I know that I tried by default in other cities, right? Having to change home just for going to get a PhD, because the only available place there was another country, and if not, they would have had to wait another year for not knowing whether they would have passed the next year. So I was even in there terribly lucky in a way to score the hit in kind of sound at the best faculty in my country, if not, I can say it without any modesty, in Europe, for living 3 kilometers from it, and just studying here, remaining here, and connecting myself here. It was the best thing, right? So that's why I was disgustingly lucky, because I had easily I could have failed. You see, part of the reason I started Schwerpunkt, I had started first a Facebook page exactly in those days, because I said, it's over, right? I won't pass, I won't make it, I won't get in. I have to start doing something else. That now, just with a master in, medieval history, where do I go? Right? Instead, 4 years later, here I am, and I have done more than something about that. So I feel too bad, because speaking from the standpoint again of somebody who had it that easy. If you want, in some ways without earning that, or at least maybe earning that during the actual work, but also in there, as I explained to you, depending on factors that didn't have to do with my own specific capacity, but with some unpredictable events, let's say determinants. So my advice does remain to be, of course, aware of what has been written before that, because you will have to relate about it in the selection, especially if it's a serious thing, and yet wanted to discover the question. And I'll tell you this, that every research, in a sense, gets redefined at the beginning. It's very common for everybody to start with a mega project that involves, like something like an end of career research type of work, and that eventually gets resized and it becomes something smaller. In my case, it was the opposite. That's why I don't know sometimes whether my example is so great for the average, because I went the other way around. For dynamics that are kind of crazy. First of all, you would be surprised to know that I started this research and continued it without being followed by any kind of expert on the topic, which to some people may sound crazy, because they go by the manual and they say, okay, I need an expert, the best expert in the world about this. And it's kind of normal, because you really want to be in contact with somebody who knows better than you. The problem is that if you're still trying to sort out what you have to do, and you're confused about that because you still don't have a point of reference, okay, that person can become the point of reference, but at the same time, it can even confuse your views, right? It could influence you in a way you wouldn't like. I actually had a co-tutor who was, a great expert, if not much of the, of the art of war at the time, but he has studied knighthood in the same period, in the same place. He was kind of an expert of the broader political and social context. This person was completely useless to me. Like, it was a honor and a privilege, because he's also a famous historian internationally. But I simply said, like, no, like I don't need this person. This was the first time I talked to him. I said, I'm studying this, and this person told me, I know nothing about that. Because objectively, I was the only one who studied the art of war. And the top guy in my country who, and I don't know whether abroad there is, strictly speaking, somebody who does the same thing, and surely not knowing the field I was studying, I mean the country was studying, because I knew that for sure, for that matter, is a guy that, again, has not studied more art of war than I did. And so this was even at the moment of the correction, where of course everything went well, but at the point I had even to explain certain things to these people, or at least trying to make it understand, because they didn't get there what I had done. I said my tutor who followed me all the time, she was absolutely not expert on that thing. She actually, by following me step by step, actually she said, this work is good. Because I managed over time to make her, I mean, all the others said the work was good, but they were kind of disoriented by it. That instead she was, even as a profane, she said, I understand what this work is about, and I understand it's worthy, and I understand you have done it well. And I say this because for me, it is a matter of pride to have done that well, essentially following my own intuition and my own previous military education, in spite of what others thought that I should have done. Because I have received so many different suggestions that if I had followed, I would have not made the thesis, first of all, and by character, I'm very low in agreeability, let's say, and I absolutely say no, right? I say no, right? I didn't do anything to appease anybody, to give credit to anybody. This was my research, and I knew how to make it. I saw it in my mind. The others wouldn't, and so I didn't care about what others thought if they couldn't see the same thing I was seeing. Right, after having, of course, talked and listening what they had to say, because if somebody had been in my same wave and would have told me, look, I understand what you're doing here and there, maybe you should do this better here and there. Of course, there were some minor advice I took, of course, that's normal, but let's say the essence of it, and properly the strictly military and purely military character of my research, was something that I couldn't find anybody who would understand. And I confess that I did suffer of it. I mean, I didn't suffer in the sense that I wish I had find some. Actually, this was better for me because I'm very jealous of my work in a sense, and so I could spend it better. I have less competitors. It's fine, right? It's very good, right? It's good that somebody has not studied all these things for me. Maybe it's not good for the world, right? But still, I can profit from it and still maybe helping the world in the meanwhile. So I'm again kind of with my eccentric interests, I'm kind of lucky to have chosen them properly and to have followed my way, my path, not having been influenced by anybody. And in fact, I was always told, look, you've always been working. Like, it's a bit like even my colleagues, they told me that we don't work that much after all. We lose time with conferences and have nothing to do maybe with our research, but still, do it because the coverage is and then they had to prolong the doctorate without even being paid because they hadn't finished in time. I worked kind of tribal of them because I wrote something again that is normally more than double than the average, like, and so I did all that thing, by the way, alone. And nobody would essentially understand me all the way through until I presented this. And it did I must say, I say this because the important thing is there that showing you how much you can produce even when you have doubts at the beginning. Because if at the beginning, if you do have an idea and it's valid and you know that it's what you want to understand and you know that there is only one way to make it work and you know what method to use, and not just being influenced by somebody else's arbitrary judgment, and you can spot that, you are already a winner in a sense because you already know what needs to be done. Then doing it really is a challenge, yes, and you can fail, but still the attitude, that sap, that combination between knowledge, determination, motivation, coup d'oeil, right? It is a very Clausewitzian thing, after all. It is a war, it is a battle, it is a campaign, right? There are setbacks, there are situations that will make you despair at some point. There is the imposter syndrome, that strikes, man, it's a serious problem. I went through some stages throughout this, but I must say that if you have that idea and that will work as your helm through the tempest, through the storm, right? That's the important thing, and that all begins with a question, right? If it is a good question, if you know that you can find an answer, that there is an answer, right? One of the advantages of having a bit more of a general question, not just in the sense that, of course, everybody, as we were saying before, tends to want to do a lot and then eventually redefines the work during the same research, which is perfectly fine, is allowed. There is a lot of flexibility. The system does work like that. Is normal, but at that point, the people become ever more specialized in the process. If you still can't keep the thing kind of general, you have more things to answer, right? For example, some of my colleagues that I think are better than me in researching, they're always out, go conferences, archives, and so on, did nothing of this because most of my work was, the sources were all published, and I consulted a lot of them, so that was the quality because it was a very large system to sort out. But fundamentally, those guys made, in that sense, more work than me, just because they physically did it, right? But there were smaller things, and still, however, as a system, and still, however, they weren't sure, and they wouldn't know whether they would find their own answer in the archive. I know a guy that is essentially he's a modernist. It's been the closest person, at least during the PhD, because we had even similar, we knew each other well, because we had basically started universities together and all these things. And this person, I consider him to be more intelligent than me, but he was still struggling because he hadn't found the documents. He wanted the evidence he wanted to find in the archives. So he had based all his research on a gamble, right? It was much more than a gamble, because literally, if you don't find that evidence, the quality of the work sinks. Because if you have based the whole thing on finding that evidence as the premise of the work, right? You're kind of betting on something that doesn't have many backup plans, right? In that sense, I instead knew that no matter how the research would go, I would always knew how to give an answer, because after all, I was first of all gaining evidence after evidence about things that was already published, chronicles of the 14th century, of the 13th century. It was there, sources known from centuries, but this doesn't mean that we have understood everything, we have studied everything, especially if there's never been kind of a specific strategical or tactical study on the field. You know that those sources are okay, and whatever answer you will find is that you're plenty of evidence to reason upon, and therefore you surely won't have a blank paper crisis. I can tell you never had that, and I can't even tell you how to surpass that, for that matter. Much of that has to do, and let's be honest with that, is that with the range of how much you're willing to encompass with your mind, the greater the least crisis of blank paper you will ever have, because you have to start with an idea, a concept, the same question. In my case, it was quite simple. Why didn't in that region infantry prevail over cavalry in that period? And then you start studying the battles and the campaigns, and you start observing what the composition of the armies, and you start understanding a lot about that power, that seigneury, that city, that all these things, and you start acquiring the knowledge of, you see that power behaved like that because it had that feature. You start understanding the scale of power, right? What people would like to know normally, I understand from my videos too, is how powerful was that kingdom, how powerful was that one compared. Again, if you don't make a comparative study, you will never know that. And normally, studies about history do not quite contemplate much of this concrete assessment. Why? Because most studies are kind of relativistic, going in circle stuff. They don't care about finding kind of an objective standard and evaluating different stuff on the base of the same, and adjusting the method and the thing and along the way, and coming up with a quite concrete answer. No, it's kind of an idea, of a thought, of a scientific kind of take on whatever you think the deep implication or the interpretative problems. There are not interpretative problems if you have actually studied well the thing. You may miss an evidence, you may not know something, but in general, if you have the more you have studied, the deeper you have gone, and the more something concrete emerges. So all this relativism that is taking over basically at every level of our civilization does stem from the fact that concretely people are, say, lying to themselves into thinking that they're actually capable or by standard, by default, competent or intelligent. Right? They don't actually do anything to prove that. They don't work anymore. They don't spit blood on their and sweat and tear anymore for their job, and that's the problem. That means knowing less, having less, but instead, a formal education like this one does put you under the pressure that you kind of deserve to be in order to achieve that level. So that's why it's so important even to reason on these things. So in a way, my advice is keep it simple, right? Don't overthink. Don't go search for very or too specific topics, niches where nobody will eventually even kind of look in, just because you can say that's my own thing and nobody can touch it. Start reasoning big. Start reasoning about a pretty concrete, like as I've done. It's a lot of work, right? And if you don't have any progressed experience, it can be very risky as well in a sense. But if you know a certain place, for example, I started a PhD without having ever written about the times and places of my PhD topic. My bachelor and master thesis were something completely different. Relatively, at least they were still about warfare, yes, but in different times and places. So if I had started studying the same times and places of my doctoral research since the beginning of university, I would have come to my PhD with a much better idea, and surely I would have done things in a much better way, much easier way. So that is an advice, and for that matter, at that point, do choose something of the scale I did, right? A regional context, essentially, a good time span. It can be half of a century. And then the idea of covering basically most of what you can find there. This, of course, varies depending on the centuries. Like, for example, my own is very well documented at that point. So it can become difficult, and people think either you have a great capacity of abstraction. But let's say, again, if you take your time to get into details and to read things in a unitary way, you have a good historiography that backs your understanding of these things, you're advantaged. Right, and you know what you can do. And also, in this sense, think of something that goes out of the schemes a little bit. And in that sense, not by choosing the weirdest topic ever. Right, I know because in my department we are together with historians of religions, anthropologists, and so on. So sometimes there are things that are so distant. But I don't know. I know people who went making a research on the tattoos of a certain islands in Oceania, interviewing wizards about that, because nobody had ever written about that. I mean, okay, you want to go on vacation in the Pacific with the scholarship money. I understand that, right? And unfortunately, there's been a pandemic, and probably the thing, your plans have been frustrated. I didn't wish that to person, but let's say it's such a topic that I would never choose, even as if I were an anthropologist. My way of mind-blowing people is like try to show, which is also done usually, that what has been already studied requires really a lot of other thinking and methods and ways of studying. Because let's be honest, it's not even about the topic, right? The topic in itself, the topics are infinite, even just historically speaking, right? It was a surprise for me to understand how few early 14th century warfare was actually studied in a serious way. And yet, people normally think that instead there is, because there are enough books, after all, that talk about that. But until you read those books, you don't realize that those books aren't actually covering the whole deal. They're not even trying to. They're not providing you with the tools to frame the whole problem in a more extensive way. They really put boundaries and that there shouldn't be there, that impede you a broader vision. And therefore, what you should do is to get at the roots of the problem, to say, why isn't, for example, this thing been explained yet? You can have your own ideas, you can hypothesize that, but also let's do the thing that these people haven't done on the same history that allegedly we know, and that instead, no, we don't. because nobody had made, for example, the strategical and tactical analysis that I did on that specific area of Europe. And it's, a Western European situation that you would think, at this point we have covered everything about in terms of general history. Yes, in general history, and also more, of course, in-depth things. And there is, it's an extremely prolific, to say the least, historiography. Hundreds of, I don't know, probably tens of thousands of books written on just in that period, etc. But let's say none of those looking at the art of war, and none of those doing that in a comprehensive fashion. That is to say, again, it can be one book about one battle, okay? The guy who wrote that book about that battle didn't study actually other battles. Maybe that was just local historiography. The guy did it because it was his own town. Or somebody likes war, but just, again, there is a lot of localism in this regard. And this it does exist, so that doesn't encompass the broader view that you need comparatively and diachronically to understand what also that actual battle, what relevance that battle actually had in the broader topic. The same goes at an international level. My region was never studied because, people abroad, like in that region, they didn't study it that much. People abroad didn't care that much, even as a consequence in part. They just thought about other regions. And so nobody actually looked at the whole deal. Part of the reason, for example, we're fixated with the rise of infantries in that regard is that, again, we have a prejudice, a bias towards that. We think that was the future. Well, it wasn't really, because it started from dramatically different premises from the ones that that eventually brought to infantry takeover during the Renaissance. So completely different views and ideas on why should we pick even like the victory of infantry solely as a proof, for example, of a military cultural development or quality of some sort, which, for example, might thesis question deeply. Right, the same goes for other people, again, writing about one battle because there was a national mythology about that battle. And so it has to be important even when you write a book that debunks the mythological thing, because still your bias is that battle is important, right? And it's always been important. Therefore, if many other people have written it's important, you don't need to look elsewhere to realize that maybe that battle is not that important, because you don't really want to hear that, right? Or that, maybe it's not that battle was not that important, but there were maybe more important things that other people haven't seen, because again, they haven't quite ever tried to look at the broader comparative perspective. So that topic choice to me was very lucky, was very fortunate, let's say. I'm glad to have chosen the topic. I'm glad to have started thinking that I would have to resize my own expectations, ambitions for that matter. And instead, I end up writing something that went far beyond those expectations, properly in terms of scale and properly temporal and territorial scale. And so all the enormous amount of evidence more than I managed to frame. So think about how that lack of source references at the beginning in a complete fashion could influence so much my moral resources to think smaller and therefore worse, right? The idea was good. I would have just written a bad thesis or bailed out if I had followed that path. Instead, I had the possibility to make it shine. So in my view, of course, taking the risk is always a double-edged sword in that regard. But at the same time, if you don't take risks, you can never get anything done. So given that, as I was saying before, my my sole objective at that point was to finish my master thesis in the same time and say, of course, getting in the PhD without master thesis I couldn't, but getting in the actual winning the selection. That was my first objective, because when you start, at least you have your own amount of time to say, okay, now at least I am in, right? And you kind of, brag about this and you cuddle yourself. You think that, we'll have all the time in the world. Then after some months, you realize that months are running already away. And therefore, you have to find out a real solution, not just thinking, I won. You have to make the work, right? But if of course, in order to make the work, you have to get in the first place. So you have to play smart a little bit, which doesn't take much. And my take on it, I repeat it, think that kind of scale of question, act like confidently. I was always, I must say this, that sometimes people think that I have, like, I'm a very thoughtful person. Because I like to understand things. So sometimes when I don't know things, I have scruples because I say, what can I say if I don't know correctly this thing? Will I lie? No, instead your objective is to be sure of that, what you do. To be sure of the intuition, of the value of the intuition, of saying, I know that the answer is important. I don't know maybe how I'll get there, and maybe I can fake a little bit just in the way I think I can get there, theoretically, and everybody kind of knows that at the beginning you don't really know how to make the thing, and you have still to sort it out. But exactly for that reason, if you are confident, you will pass. In fact, during the selection, when I had to discuss my topic, I even kind of spoke back to a criticism of the same person who was evaluating me, and that person was, instead of getting triggered, because basically it was already in given the points that I had, that person said, like she was pleased by the fact that I had, answered her, even with kind of a temper, and she said, I like that, because that's how you should act. That's how you should present yourself. You never think, never look insecure, or even if you do, like, present what's the problem, present what's the question, right? Because there may be serious questions about why you're doing this. Many people getting, again, in these kind of research without even I know people that arrive at the end of the research. It happened with one of my colleagues that they didn't even have concluded the thing by the deadline, and they hadn't quite envisaged that if you enter with that mentality and you stay for that long with them, either you have fooled everybody, but first of all, you have fooled yourself. So there are these kind of people that tend to be, by default, chronically insecure, right? Another thing is properly being, having doubts, but kind of still feeling that the right way is that one, and so you should follow. So yeah, I can't think of other things, and maybe just what I wanted to say was that I was particularly lucky not to have any influence on me during the research, right? My tutor let me completely free because I had established with her a long term relation of trust. So she knew how I worked, and she believed in me, even too much, because, as I said, at the beginning of the first year, I wasn't actually doing much, and she tried to help me, even in front of the other, of the, let's say, of the commission, to say, well, he's working, but factually, I had been working, but it wasn't leading me necessarily everywhere. And she probably understood there that it does take time, that I had my time, that I'm a person that takes a while thinking on things and knowing how to operate. And in fact, I started even just for a lucky reason. So again, that's why I think that she was too light maybe on me. But the others wouldn't understand what I was doing either. So most of their concerns were just based on the unusual behavior that I mostly had during the thing, because I was completely uninterested to any other kind of university activity there. And so I was just never going there, and so they thought I wasn't working, and they wanted more reassurances that I was. And I gave them. It's just that making them understand again the type of work I was doing was more complicated than I thought. And at a certain point, I said, well, I shouldn't even waste all this time to tell them something that I'm actually doing, and that I know is working. And when I try to explain, they don't evenly understand. So until it's done, they can't factually see what it is. In any case, this is important instead, because, as I was saying in the beginning, there are many doctoral researchers that are deeply influenced by professors that essentially make you do the research that they want you to do for them, in a sense, and that have a very heavy power on this. There is a lot of corruption in these environments. Say that all over the academia, everywhere. Like in my own case, I haven't quite seen it. I've seen it just incidentally by hearsay in another context. It was not the one of my PhD, but I know consistently that in certain environments it's very easy to it's mostly because there are money gravitating around certain institutions, etc. Instead, in my place, I had the lack of this tradition that we have in our faculty, in our capital, that is originally all the best scholars came there. So they came from different from the country, I mean, and they came all from different backgrounds, so different disciplines, right? So it wasn't like a provincial school where let's say it was just, they just studied one specific thing, and more or less all the professors studied that, specialized in that. Right there, we were habituated from traditionally to have many different, let's say, a interdisciplinary or better multidisciplinary approach, so that everybody would study a different thing. So it set the standards, to say, for really allowing also the students to really study whatever they wanted, or at least having more choice at that point. That happened maybe one generation ago, but the system remained, and so I wasn't pressured by anybody, nor I had any expert there was kind of on me, trying to make me do whatever he or she wanted. I was free, and this is an abnormal condition. I wasn't writing that thesis for anybody but myself. And I was completely free, and aside from those despicable doctoral didactic that, we were enforced Sovietically just to get the, to participate to the various faculties competition for getting more money from the state for the scholarships, from the bureaucrats, let's say, I was really free, right? And so I treasured that experience, because I know that for example, in other university tradition also there is, for example, you have to produce articles like crazy. Like you have a thesis, but you have to write kind of, a certain proportion of small theses, like, let's say number of small theses throughout the years to prove that you're working. I had none of this. I had just an annual report where I had to explain what I had to do and participating to kind of these doctoral activities to show around. But I didn't have to do anything else. It would have been impossible for me, for example, in that amount of time to write smaller articles just for the sake, for the university to show that I was producing. Everything is already functionalized to the publishing, to all the money that revolve around that, from the curriculum, that the various classes of reviews, all these things. That's despicable, right? A person who makes a doctoral research has to learn a lot of things. You can, and with the amount of time that is necessary for it, you cannot have qualitative work if you force the student to produce that amount. You will have all small kind of dissected topics with a lower, heuristic, comprehensive, scientific relevance that will get in the meat grinder. Nobody will read just for proving that you're doing something about that. I mean, I understand the risk that exists with people kind of, trying to show that they're working while they are. In fact, there was a problem like that person I told you that didn't actually finish in time, and she hadn't told anybody before basically almost the end, and that's why also they enforced us the Sovietic means of didactic. Yes, I hated that, and they pressured me to say, what are you doing specifically, because you don't show up, you don't talk, you don't even answer sometimes the calls. What are you doing? And I was doing something, and I saw what I did, right? But everybody has to be also, like, everybody's different, right? So I'm not saying this because I believe, again, there should be a uniform discipline and everything, but if I'm actually working, I'm not obliged by any regulation to show you what I'm doing, aside from reporting what I'm doing at the end of every year. Like, it's your problem, not mine, right? And so I'm stern but fair about these things as well. And so instead, I know that elsewhere it works in other ways. So at that point, the PhD can really become frustrating, and that's really why many say, I don't want this because it's pressuring. If, for example, I work a lot, but if I'm even under the slightest pressure, I just don't like it. I get nervous. I don't want to hear. I know what I have to do. I already am a historian. I don't have to be told what I have to do. Let me work, and you'll see what it comes out. So with other people, it's different. Other people have to be brought under that pressure to be productive in the first place. I'm not. Right? I pressure myself. I'm motivated to do it. I'm determined to do it. I'm square. I do things the way I've seen. I follow my track. That's it. Right? So it can be different from you. Like if you are particularly that there are people who are fragile, but usually those do not make it to the PhD. And the experience can pressure you more than before. So there are some boundaries there that I think I never crossed. Like for example, even with the pandemic, I never felt alienated because I had to work digitally. I've always been working digitally, and it hasn't affected me slightly. What's this thing about alienation? Are we all grown without spine? Like I know it happens, right? It is, but alienation at that point is mostly about how you manage your life, not just because you work at a computer. Right, I know people that couldn't stand the pandemic because they got anxious. They had to get out. They had to stay all the damn time at university, and they're the same people, in fact, wouldn't finish their PhD in time because for them, university is just meeting with other people, being in the middle of this kind of academic hour or participating to cover, and then maybe not concluding much. I believe that we should give individuals the backbone to be independent. Responsible, productive, capable, skilled, but in this sense not to pretend that we have to be brought all under the same cauldron and being obliged to do things that objectively do not even serve the purpose of our research just because we have to share and talk and communicate. But we are bombarded by this thing of we all have to do everything in common. No, we don't have to, right? We don't have to tell about each other's lives to give part of our life. For what? For something that we don't even want to do, right? Anyhow, these are other considerations now that they don't really fit the thing. But let's say that there are consistent issues relatively to. I didn't talk too much today about the topic, but again, as I said at the beginning, that's just something you should find out by yourself. You can't really find obviously somebody else finding a topic for you, right? If you are a person like there are people who tend to follow others instead, right? And surely those probably already follow professors. They want to get their ideas from them and always saying I'm not like that, so I don't believe in it. I don't know how it is, how it works. So at that point, you have your point of reference. You don't need my advice. And, in any case, you chose it yourself. I mean, yeah. In general, just don't overthink too much about the topic. Just make it clear, make it sensible. Do not invent history that doesn't exist. Do not force logical connections just for creating your own topic, your own question. Be aware of what's been written. Be confident in presenting the thing, right? Don't fear that you will be judged on the base of. I mean, you will be judged also on the base of that, but not only of that, not only of the question per se, but of how you presented the motivation. Naturally, you should provide just with the explanation of why that topic is important. What is it relevant? What is that can bring to the fore scientifically? And that's what you should already know, because you don't want to present something unfruitful. You have to work for years that doesn't eventually bring to something that you don't even believe in the importance of, right? It's kind of obvious. And also believing in your own intuition. Like even again, when you don't know how this thing is gonna go, just try to, like, if you know your deal, the more you know, and the more, and that's why the simplicity is key there. Because like in my research, you could say I had virtually no experience whatsoever in that path, but I knew something macroscopic enough to make that made sense. Why did a certain region of Europe evolve its infantry and the other didn't? Apparently, by the way. Why did, say better, technically, in some countries they want more winning. I mean, the infantry is, I mean, the answer is obvious, right? They fought with what they had, but sometimes this is not understood. Sometimes there is still a bias in the form of, the tactical, the almost doctrinal, anachronistically speaking, answer. The idea that, again, infantry is the future, right? And in the 14th century they thought things would evolve just as no, they wouldn't. And in fact, you should be listening to what the sources say also in your own way, not much what the scholarships say, because scholarship is not really that reliable as you may think. And one should start assessing these things. Even historiography changes in opinion. Never be intimidated by big names, the big professors. They're not, right? It doesn't exist, right? Our scientific understanding of the world is constantly floating in ways that, of course, we don't want to hear, because, of course, it strips us of security in a way. But in a way, that's the beauty of it. Go find it out by yourself. If you are the one who wants to search for these things, you have to acknowledge that, after all, most of our understanding is limited, as much as the one you will try to make sense of in your research in that sense, and that you have to be more refined. You have to be more responsible in that sense. And so choosing something sounder and safer, even if it's a bigger work, it's very often the better idea. What's better than finding at the end of this work the good answer for something more important than others didn't even try to make? It was my case, and I don't even think I'm that capable, but I just was motivated enough to do it, and I did it. Right? It wasn't enough. I was lucky, again, as I said, but I did that. Right? Not something else, not a portion of it, not something that we will learn how easy it is to do something that, again, on the same path, but doing it badly because you don't have enough vision or confidence or understanding of even of the potential that lays beyond certain things. So, again, maybe what I should have addressed relatively to the topic choice is something that, however, we'll see along the path on the method when I gathered the sources, because that's where I was confronted with, okay, I got in with this. I think I wrote the project in a week, right? It wasn't that difficult, and then I had to cope to develop from some thousands of words to essentially a 700 pages of original work. Well, that's something else, right? So we'll see how it went. For now, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.